Question number 7. Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Minister of Education. How will her Communities of Online Learning, or COOLS, proposal differ from online charter schools in the United States, given a study partially funded by a private pro-charter foundation found students attending those schools lost an average of about 72 days of learning and reading and 180 days of learning in maths during the course of a 180-day school year?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, significantly. As I set out in the answer to the previous question, before a provider could become a community of online learning, they must undergo an accreditation regime, be subject to an intervention regime, provide evidence of their capacity to provide pastoral care, be subject to an accountability regime, and demonstrate that they meet strict enrolment criteria, for example, a restriction on the enrolment of students for whom there is a high risk of disengagement in an online environment. Mr Speaker, we have put these checks and balances in place because, like the Labor Party in their Future of Work document, we agree that, and I quote from Labor's Future of Work document, because people can obtain entire qualifications online with the same quality of direct learning and engagement as if they were on site.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Does her own regulatory impact statement state, quote, historically academic achievement for New Zealand correspondence school students is lower than that of students in face-to-face education. Engagement can also be low, end quote. If so, what New Zealand evidence does she have that fully online learning, which is allowed for in this bill, will result in better educational achievement?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, the member is damning 23,000 students, which is the role of Te Kura, the biggest school in New Zealand. And of course they have problems and challenges. Absolutely, and the RIS outlines that, so I'm glad the member's taken advantage of it. But like all schools in New Zealand who do face difficulties with engagement and achievement, so too does Te Kura, and they do a significantly good job with those kids who have been disengaged from other schools. And as Dame Karen Sewell, the chair of Te Kura, has already publicly said, she welcomes this new approach and looks forward to Te Kura becoming a community of online learning.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, David Seymour.
Is the Minister aware that the study referred to in the primary question was popularised earlier this week in the American show Last Week Tonight with John Oliver? And if indeed that is how the member researched this primary question, would that be an example of online learning?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, to answer that question in reverse order, yes, it would be an example of that. And in answer to the first part, unlike the opposition who use overseas comedy writers as the font of their knowledge, we do not.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaking to the Minister, does the Minister find it very odd when she constantly gets to read reports from people who claim they want children in New Zealand to get a better education, and especially the least well-off New Zealanders, and never want to do anything different other than just back up their union mates?
Order. The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, it is terribly disappointing for New Zealand parents who are very focused on how they get the best education for their kids and are constantly obstructed by naysayers.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Order.
I hate the teachers. Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Order. A little less interjection from my immediate right. Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Is she seriously suggesting that a primary school child sitting at home in their bedroom in front of a laptop or a tablet is going to get an education at least as good as a child sitting in a classroom, surrounded by their peers and with a fully trained and qualified teacher guiding their learning?
The Honourable Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, unlike the opposition, I don't propose to prescribe for every child in this country, or hypothetically, no, I don't. And that's why the bill is full of enabling provisions, because we actually trust New Zealanders to make choices for themselves rather than have them prescribed to them by all-knowing other people.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, to the Minister, is the Minister aware that in Stewart Island, the school there has 28 pupils? Those 28 pupils are all learning Mandarin, the entire school, and they're learning online. And isn't that a great thing that young kids in Stewart Island are learning Chinese?
Order. The first part of the question is in order. Supplementary question should only have one leg to them. The Honourable Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I am aware of that. I'm equally aware that Te Kura Kaupapa Māori o Te Waiu o Ngāti Porou in Ruatoria is teaching physics and chemistry in Te Reo Māori to other parts of the country. And the members of the opposition seem confused about this policy, because in my answer I made it clear that mainstream schools can be incorporated in this policy as providers of online learning.
Supplementary question. Supplementary question.
Order. 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 Now we have a discussion between two front benches which will cease. Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Can she confirm that all of the students mentioned in her answer and in the Prime Minister's question were attending a school? And what evidence does she have that they will get an equally good education if they are at home by themselves without a teacher?
Again. The Honourable Hipkins.
Again, the member falls victim to his own prejudices. In the policy that we have laid out, we have said there are a full range of options of what these schools could be like. It includes provision by existing mainstream schools. It includes provision by existing tertiary institutions. And it includes provision by private providers. We are not saying what proposals yet will be acceptable.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Does she at least accept the irony that while she's talking about opening up more flexibility and choice, she's massively reducing the flexibility and autonomy offered to existing public schools and subjecting them in the same bill to even more compliance and red tape?
The Honourable Hipkins.
I do not, Mr Speaker, because this government has invested over $700 million into those exact same schools to ensure that they can have digital technology, 24/7, ultra-fast, good quality broadband data at no cost to them. And we have incorporated, as of a month ago, digital technology as a core part of the curriculum. This is a next step because this government is future-focused, living now in the present and providing for our young people to be internationally connected. Yeah, very disappointing for those still living in the past. I understand that.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
When her bulk funding proposal results in schools reducing the number of subjects on offer, is she going to suggest to those students who can no longer take the subjects in the school that they want to, that they can enrol online rather than have the teacher in front of them as they have had previously?
The Honourable Hipkins.
First of all, Mr Speaker, I have no proposal around bulk funding. Second of all, in the funding review, we're still in the middle of a consultation process. Third to know, schools already do offer blended learning, and they do offer them outside the boundaries of their own school. And fourthly, our government is absolutely supportive of that kind of collaboration.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, has the Minister of Education seen a press release by the Labour Party from Jenny Selassie saying that when it comes to Pacific population and bilingualism in New Zealand, the Associate Education spokesperson for Labour said this is a crucial
Order. There's absolutely no order. I don't need help from Mr Chris Bishop. There is no ministerial responsibility, and secondly, it is a question that I perceive is designed to attack the opposition party, which is in breach of Speaker's rulings. No, I'm not interested in arguing about it. If it's another matter, I'll happily hear it. Point of order, Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table a press release then.
No, and I'm not prepared to put the leave. Further supplementary?
Supplementary question to the Minister.
Order. Supplementary question, Marama Fox.
In addition to digital technologies being made a core curriculum subject, will the Minister consider Te Reo Māori and the New Zealand land rules also being made a core curriculum subject?
The Honourable Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, Te Reo Māori has exactly the same status in our curriculum as digital technology. It is available in any school that parents wish it to be available, and it is resourced accordingly. It is true. And in terms of the... So from the past, and in terms of ngā whawhainui o Aotearoa, because the Māori Party has made strong advocacy to beef up the resources around Māori history, we have developed a significant website, and I thank the Māori Party for that constructive advocacy.
Question number 8.